Thank you. One more time, give it up for Professor Norman Finkelstein.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm often asked why I'm supporting Dr. Cornel West, and this is as useful an occasion as any to clarify my opinion on the subject. I'm going to begin not with a formal history lesson, but with a personal one, which is to describe the world that I grew up in. Now, the world I'm about to describe applied to about 80% of Americans. I recognize that what I'm about to describe did not apply to about 20% of Americans, what the author Michael Harrington famously called the other America. And I read recently that Dr. West was acquainted with Michael Harrington on a personal basis. I myself was not. In any event, what did the world look like back then? Number one, schools were free. City University of New York, all of its units, Hunter College, Brooklyn College, Queens College, Staten Island College, and so forth, they were all free. There was no student tuition. The state universities, Binghamton, Albany, Stony Brook, Buffalo, and so forth, they were for all intents and purposes free. Most everybody received what was called back then a Regents Scholarship, and that meant you didn't have to pay tuition, and room and board was nominal. So, college was free. Even the private schools, like where Dr. West attended Harvard, my memory is, but he's the authority, not me, Harvard was $3,000 a year, which, even if you factor in inflation, is nowhere near where these schools are now. The bottom line was, school was free, which was not a trivial fact, not just because you may have come from a poor background, but because it was free, you were intellectually able to explore. You didn't feel like you were squandering hard-earned money if you took courses which seemed kind of eccentric, because it was all free. And so people were able to major in things like anthropology, sociology, English, and not have a debt when they came out. Nowadays, to jump ahead for a moment, that's no longer the case. Students are looking for a direct fit between the courses or their majors and a job after graduation. There is no longer any exploration, any intellectual inquiry permitted to this generation. So, schools being free, when you came out, there was no student debt. Now, when I say there was no student debt, I mean that literally. So, there were some students who didn't have to, who weren't able to make ends meet, and they took out what were called back then federal loans. However, here was the thing. All those students who took out loans, they all defaulted. The government didn't care. I know that for a fact, because I had friends who, they defaulted. There wasn't credit cards back then, at least not widely used. There wasn't a credit rating back then. And so the biggest burden of young people nowadays, if you walk arbitrarily with any young person nowadays, it doesn't take 10 minutes before the conversation comes around to student debt. That wasn't the case back then. Now, when we went to college, with the exception of pre-meds, I don't remember a single person ever talking about a job when they got out of school. We didn't think about that. Those college years were those grand entitlements to, as it was called back then, and I think it's a fair expression, to discover yourself. Because we were all confident that when we were ready to find a job, there would be a job there. There was never a fear back then that there wouldn't be a job waiting for you when you got out of school. And in fact, I can tell you, if you look at, say, my high school class, I had one friend, she wanted to go into theater. She ended up being a stage manager. Another friend wanted to do something with film. He ended up being a film festival impresario. And so on and so on. Several wanted to be actors, they became actors. What does that mean? No tuition, no debt, discover yourself, there is a job out there, and there's a real likelihood that your dream could actually come true. It wasn't high in the sky. Your dreams, as our society functioned for 80%, your dreams in our society were actually realizable. Now, the point I'm making is, I think, fairly obvious to anyone here, because for 80% of our society, those dreams are no longer realizable. For 20%, if you live in New York, if you're in what's called the professions, medicine, law, or if you're in finance or IT, yes, you will probably fall within that 20% who are making it. But if you aren't in those categories, there's no future in this society for you. It's a futureless future for about 80% of our society. I will add just one other personal anecdote. There was a period where I was working on my doctoral dissertation, and I needed an income to support myself. So I worked on 10th Avenue and 26th Street at a place called the Hudson Guild. It's a settlement house. And I worked with poor kids from the projects. I worked with them from 2 to 6 p.m. after school. Now, I was in the poorest union. It was all Black and Latino women. And as you can imagine, I'm talking about the 1980s, exactly as you would expect, it was the poorest union in the city. But here's the bottom line. Number one, I earned enough from 4 hours. I worked from 2 to 6. I earned enough to keep my own apartment. No roommates. I lived in Washington Heights, Elwood and Nagel. Could still afford my own apartment. 4 hours a day. We had, I know this is going to sound like pie in the sky, given the world that most of you have inherited. The poorest union, we had sick days. We had vacation days. We had personal days. This vast accumulation of, so to speak, holiday time. There were so many days that when I finally left the job in 1987, when I got my degree, I had accumulated more than 100 days, which I never used. That's what it was like back then. So, the first reason I'm here is because something is radically wrong with our society. The proportions have shifted from 80% being able to have a realistic prospect of realizing their dreams, or if not realizing their dreams, at least living a relatively decent and dignified life. The 20%, as Dr. West likes to call it, and here I'm just quoting him, the chocolate side of town, it was obviously very different. Just on a personal note, I've not discussed it with Dr. West, I was surprised to learn and reading about him that he said he finished Harvard in 3 years rather than 4 because of the tuition issue. And that did surprise me because I don't recall tuition being a problem back then. Yes, I would say I decided not to go to a good school because my father was a hard-working laborer. He counted our pennies, and I didn't feel it was fair to him. But on the other side, I didn't know that you could default. That came later. So, I teach at Hunter College. I teach mostly first-generation immigrants, some white students. In this current class of 35, there are 3 white students. What we used to call, I don't know if the words are still used, we used to call them white ethnics, which meant Italian, Irish, from places like Bensonhurst and Staten Island. It's a very working class and school, Hunter. And what strikes me most in the students is it is true, and we should never quarrel with facts. It is true that the fundamental preparation, because of the grossly deteriorating schools, it is true the quality has declined in preparation. But the minds are still very nimble. They're very sharp. They're very critical. Last week, I invited the actress who's active on the Gaza issue. Some of you may know the older people in the room, Deborah Winger, who attended my class. And at the end of the class, I didn't tell them that she was observing. I said to her, so what did you think of the class? And I'm telling you the honest to God truth. She teared up. And she said, it's moments like this that give me hope for the future. And that's the same with me. The people, what's been bequeathed to this younger generation is just grossly unfair. And there needs desperately to be people in public life who are articulating and are indignant at the unfairness of our system. And in my opinion, that is Dr. West. He articulates with remarkable eloquence, and he expresses his indignance at what this system has done to the new generations. Number 2, there is the argument that's made, and one has to take it seriously. There is the argument that's made that a vote for Dr. West is a vote for fascism, it's a vote for Trump. the two being synonymous, President Trump and former President Trump and fascism. Now, one has to be, as I said, very cautious and responsible in answering that objection. My own view, and I don't claim I have a monopoly on truth, is I do recognize there is a difference between Biden and Trump in that regard. However, even though a triumph of Biden will not in itself and immediately usher in a catastrophe as in fascism, the fact of the matter is, and I think I agreed with Dr. West, that even if that's not the immediate consequence of a Biden victory, it's simply going to be slowing a process, namely the fascist prospect. It will be slowing a process, but the process will still be underway. And I think the evidence is in that President Biden, should he be reelected, will not be a significant bulwark against or obstacle to the rise of a fascist movement in our country. That's not theoretical, because in the past 2 months, we personally witnessed the most fantastic assault on academic freedom and freedom of speech on our college campuses, not seen since the early 20th century, when there was the workers' movements and the robber barons. There were the worker movements and the robber barons wanted to get some professors, it was just a handful, one fellow named Edward Ross, another fellow named Scott Neary, wanted to get them fired. And it was at that point that the whole issue of academic freedom came up in our country. That's when the AAUP, the American Association of University Professors, all of that crystallized. Now, there has not been, since that time, an assault coming from the private sector and then compounded by the Republican right, an assault on academic freedom and free speech. Now, what did Biden do? You have to ask yourself, if you're truly concerned about the prospect of fascism in our country, what did Biden do? He didn't do anything. He went along with the claim that these campus demonstrations were anti-Semitic. He used every occasion to denounce anti-Semitism. And apart from a token phrase, I think it was at Morehouse, it's the first time I heard it, apart from a token phrase talking about the right to disagree, he didn't do anything to block or present an obstacle to this fantastic assault on freedom of speech. So I simply don't believe that if and when, and it will happen, here again I agree with Dr. West, this fascist movement will gain more and more momentum as people's lives are futureless. I don't believe he will present an obstacle to that. And then the third reason is very simple. You can say horrible things about Mr. Trump. Mr. West, Dr. West, in my opinion, calls him a gangster, and that is the fact. But of the main existential issues facing our society at this moment, just at this moment, I recognize climate change, I recognize other things, but at this moment, the main threat is now coming, existential threat, is coming from the prospect of a terminal nuclear war. And on that front, honest people have to concede that President Biden and his administration have been a catastrophe, be it with regard to Russia, be it with regard to Israel, be it with regard to Iran. All of these are terminal events waiting to happen. And on all three, oh, and I left out the most important, China. On Ukraine, Gaza, Iran, and China, these are terminal events waiting to happen, and President Biden is accelerating the move towards a terminal event waiting to happen. What Trump will do, I acknowledge, I can't predict. So it's a classic case of the fear of the known versus the fear of the unknown. But there's no doubt in my mind that on that particular front, namely the threat of nuclear war, he's a disaster. The administration is a disaster. One last thing, and then it's Dr. West's night. I attended graduate school at the same time as Dr. West. I did not know him. When he started to achieve stardom, which I would say roughly in the 1990s, when he joined what was called at the time the Harvard Dream Team, I frankly admit I was very skeptical and suspicious, because I don't believe people get into those dizzying heights of power without having accumulated a large number of skeletons in their closet. However, and there is a however, recently I did a very long interview with Dr. West, and in preparation for it, I sat down and I started to read books that he's written on his recommendation. And I have to say, his range of knowledge, but not just the range, it's the depth. A lot of people, we have an expression in English, you say of many individuals, they're a mile wide, but an inch deep. Well, you know what? Dr. West is a mile wide and a mile deep. He does know the details. I was watching the other night his Guilford lectures, and he's hurling out one name, the second name, the third name, and the fourth name, and quoting this passage. I said, okay, I give up. I give up. I'm not, my ego is now so shattered and so battered that there's no ego left to even complain or be envious. He is a real class act. When he got those degrees, he clearly earned those degrees from hard work. So, I do believe, with the possible exception of Theodore Roosevelt, should he become president, he would be the most learned president in our American history. It's very impressive. I won't speak to his political track record, but because people already know that. But the bottom line is, it's not a tough choice for me this year, and probably any other year, except the Bernie years, but Dr. West is on board with me. It's not a tough decision for me to say Dr. Cornel West for president.
Give it up for Professor Norman Finkelstein.